Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present our report here in this setting. And with me is Teja Ketarishvili. She is the project manager. And I brought her with me because she knows all the ins and outs of the report, including all the details. But I'm not going to talk too much about the details because you just gave me 25 minutes. So I have to limit myself to the highlights. The countries that we reviewed in this report, it has already been said, they vary widely, not only in terms of size and energy endowment, but also in levels of national sovereignty and political and economic structures. However, they have a shared history from which they have inherited significant similarities in national economic design, governance structure, public institutions, and infrastructure. Now, that said, over the past 2 decades, alongside political and economic developments, a diversity of regional preferences continues to emerge, based on each country's political and economic interests and aspirations. For example, the countries east of the Caspian Sea have substantially strengthened economic and trade ties with markets in Asia. Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia signed an EU association agreement in June 2014. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan and Belarus opted to establish the Russian Federation-led Eurasian Customs Union in 2010, joined by Armenia from January 2015, and soon to be joined by Kyrgyzstan and possibly Tajikistan. Now, unfortunately, throughout these transformations, the energy sector has suffered. Energy markets that were originally set up to suit central planning were no longer effective. And one of the most illustrative examples is the Central Asian power grid, which was built to serve all 5 republics in the region and continued functioning after independence, overlooking the new economic and political realities. And these new realities prompted political tensions in the region and resulted in the Central Asian economies isolating their energy systems, moving away from a regional market setup by consolidating their domestic power transmission systems in a bid to maintain higher levels of energy supply security. However, isolation and rigid thinking are not in the region's long-term best interest, and the way forward for these countries is cooperation and evidence-based strategic planning for a sustainable future. Setting up fully functional domestic energy markets and maximizing energy potential have proved difficult. And this continues to be the key focus for many governments in the region. And while most of the countries have a large body of energy sector legislation in place, implementation remains challenging. And this is due in most cases to a lack of well-elaborated secondary legislation, detailing rules and procedures for sector governance alongside concerns for rule of law. And such legislation could go a long way to making better use of the significant energy resources in the region. You know, the reviewed countries in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus and Central Asia share abundant hydrocarbon, hydro, and renewable energy resource wealth, concentrated around the Caspian and Black Sea basins. Giant oil and gas fields place the Caspian region among the richest worldwide with proven oil and gas reserves. Kazakhstan and Ukraine also possess large coal deposits, and Belarus is rich in peat, while Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia top the list of countries with ample hydro resources. Total primary energy supply in producing countries is dominated by natural gas and coal in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan are significant gas producers, while Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan are also significant in oil production. Ukraine and Kazakhstan are the main coal producers in the region. And these countries are self-sufficient on energy, while the others, including Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Moldova, Armenia, and Tajikistan, are import-dependent. And Ukraine is dependent on natural gas imports, but not coal. Renewable energy is mainly in the form of large hydro built during the Soviet Union time and in countries which have abundant water resources. However, these countries experience high seasonality of energy supply. Biofuels are significant in Georgia and Moldova. However, the exact use of biofuels in most of these countries is likely underestimated. Nuclear power is used as reliable baseload generation capacity in Ukraine and Armenia. However, Armenia's reactor has to be refurbished in the next few years in order to remain operational. And as mentioned, these regions are also considered rich in unconventional oil and gas reserves. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan also have large uranium and rare earth deposits and remain among the largest uranium suppliers to world markets. The exact potential for renewable resources in these regions has yet to be fully assessed. However, current projections and renewables mapping put in place by a number of these economies provide promising forecasts. In addition to sizable alternative and renewable sources of energy, the region's potential for energy efficiency gains is vast, but remains largely untapped. The contribution of modern renewables also remains marginal across the regions, hindered mainly by the energy sector's inability to attract investors due to evident price competition. Now, let's have a look at electricity generation. Natural gas is used in most countries, except for hydropower-rich Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. However, it's the most dominant fuel in 5 countries: Uzbekistan, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Moldova. Ukraine and Armenia have nuclear power as base load, while Ukraine is also reliant on coal. Kazakhstan is also reliant on coal due to its abundant resources. Oil is hardly used in electricity generation. Hydropower is the main source of electricity in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia, and this, as I mentioned, causes high seasonality in electricity supply and winter shortage supply security threats. Renewable other than large hydro are negligible. The most significant developments in non-large hydro renewables have been small hydropower plants in hydropower-rich countries. This primary energy mix is unlikely to change drastically in the near to long term, as little progress has been achieved towards more sustainable energy use. However, some countries in the region have set ambitious goals for renewable energy and primary source diversification. Principally Kazakhstan, with its goal of having a 50% share of alternative and renewable sources in its primary energy mix by 2050, while Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are aiming at their declared energy efficiency and renewable targets for 2020. Azerbaijan has achieved a significant decrease in energy intensity in all sectors of its economy, thanks to the replacement of oil with natural gas and the installation of new energy-efficient technologies in electricity production. Meanwhile, those countries party to the Russian-led customs union are increasingly considering installing new or expanding existing nuclear capacity to enhance their primary energy mix. Energy intensity, as you can see here, energy intensity in the region has been falling, mainly due to economic growth, which has outpaced energy demand. And in some countries, this decoupling is due to insufficient energy infrastructure, and economic growth hasn't translated in a better quality of supply. And as such, demand growth has been slower, not more efficient. Energy savings potential in these countries remains high, and targeted actions at curbing demand and improving energy efficiency are likely to result in more impressive energy intensity declines. Let's have a look at the planning for the future. More than 2 decades since gaining independence, most of the reviewed countries remain focused on current affairs, and very little attention is being paid to formulating well-elaborated visions for energy policy. Now, some countries, like Kazakhstan and Moldova, have aligned ambitious targets for energy sector development with their general economic outlook and development goals. Meanwhile, the long-term energy policy directions of Belarus, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan continue their paths of planned developments, aimed mainly at system reliability, planned growth and reduction of energy intensity of their respective economies. Armenia and Kyrgyzstan require further elaboration on their approved energy sector development concepts, whereas Azerbaijan, Georgia and Tajikistan need to replace their dated energy sector strategies with new medium to long-term strategies to implement their declared sustainable development goals. Ukraine's recently updated energy strategy to 2030, approved in June 2013, also needs to be revised to adapt to new realities, elaborating on the pressing need for swift restructuring and robust energy sector reforms. Most countries appear to be setting their energy policy preferences based on annual GDP growth targets rather than on actual energy statistics-based growth potential or sector performance patterns. Now, unfortunately, this policy design approach neglects the substantial improvements made by all reviewed countries in energy statistics data gathering in recent years. And further, the emphasis in energy data collection remains on the supply side, even though there is a strong need for accurate demand-side data collection, management, and integration in the national energy balances. Let's have a look at the potential for energy efficiency and renewables. There is considerable potential for energy savings in all sectors, particularly in district heating, electricity generation and networks, and industry and buildings. If the region were to use energy as efficiently as OECD countries do, primary energy consumption in the Caspian region as a whole would be cut by 1/2. Now, how quickly this energy efficiency potential might be exploited hinges largely on government policies, especially on energy pricing. Most countries subsidize at least one form of energy. It hinges on market reform and improved access to financing for energy projects. Unfortunately, energy efficiency governance remains vague in almost all the reviewed countries. A clear definition of the role of local governments in energy efficiency policy implementation is really of prime importance. Now, the placement of a dedicated public authority in charge of energy efficiency policies and measures, with a license to oversee the implementation of those policies, could ensure that energy efficiency is a strategic priority and could provide greater coordination. A positive element, a positive development, has been the promotion of renewable energy, where considerable progress has been observed across the regions. Most countries have put in place detailed strategies and financial support mechanisms and have relaxed investment procedures for renewable energy development. However, these measures have not yet, proven sufficient to reach the expected level of renewable technology deployment. And there's one common barrier. The common barrier to policy implementation is the absence of secondary legislation which would elaborate on legal, regulatory and financial mechanisms and on clear and enforceable technical rules for grid integration. And policy development could also greatly benefit from cost-benefit analysis, considering all renewable resources and available technologies with competitive advantages. And this would help governments further develop renewable energy strategies and promote sector development. And yet, despite such energy security risks, the region remains highly energy intensive, reflecting continued gross inefficiency in energy use, as well as climatic and structural economic factors. And of course, central to many of the decisions made on the energy mix in the region relate to energy security. A priority in the region's import-dependent countries has been diversifying import sources and routes to minimize dependence on one single source. And although recurrent supply shortages indicate a need for reliable primary or alternative fuel storage structures, this costly option has not yet been considered as a measure for enhanced energy security. Now, recent developments in Ukraine have drawn attention to the importance of sound emergency response procedures with well-elaborated demand restraint programs for import-dependent countries. And although industry is able to deal with wide-ranging, short technical faults in the system, backed by reliable technical procedures, a larger supply disruption response mechanism is yet to be put in place in most import-dependent countries in the region. Now, that said, access to energy is very high in the reviewed countries. However, there is strong evidence that despite such high electrification rate, access to modern energy services is limited in some countries, particularly outside large cities and in the remote regions where incomes are generally lowest. Average electricity consumption per capita in the residential sector in the region is low, and there are regular incidents of load shedding and brownouts, particularly in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. And these incidents in import-dependent countries are due mostly to generating fuel shortages in the supply countries. For example, low reservoir levels and poor hydrological conditions in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan provoke electricity shortages and cut-offs during the winter months. And although levels of electrification and access are high, the energy infrastructure itself is aging and requires a high level of maintenance, modernization, and rehabilitation throughout the energy supply chain. And the large capital investments required are particularly difficult to mobilize under the current pricing and regulatory structures in countries where prices remain below cost recovery levels. So fixed energy infrastructure, including centralized district heating systems and natural gas and power transmission and distribution networks, are most at risk. And the lack of investments, resulting in further inefficiencies and loss of capacity over time, could put energy security in further jeopardy. Of course, as mentioned, I do not have time to go into detail to all of the countries, to everything and for all of the countries that were studied, but let me take some time to share with you some highlights from each region. In Eastern Europe, you have Belarus, a country that has achieved solid economic growth but requires a predictable investment climate for its energy sector and the phase out of energy subsidies. Moldova lacks energy resources and is almost wholly dependent on import of fossil fuels and electricity. And among other recommendations, the report recommends that Moldova develop feed-in tariffs for renewable energy investment and improve energy statistics and data collection. Ukraine holds abundant mineral resources, including oil, natural gas, and coal, as well as a large hydro and biomass potential. However, as we all know, it has undergone two severe economic crises in the past 5 years and faces continuing security risks. Now, this report includes recommendations that Ukraine rethinks its short, medium, and long-term energy strategies in line with current realities, undertakes energy market reform, maximize energy efficiency gains and renewable energy potential, and enhances domestic gas production. The report covers 3 countries in the Caucasus. Lacking indigenous resources, Armenia imports natural gas and oil for most of its energy needs, made mainly from Russia. And recommendations for Armenia include building interconnections and strengthening energy efficiency measures, particularly in buildings and transport. Azerbaijan's current government is making renewables a priority, with an ambitious target of 20% renewables in electricity generation by 2020. And this report includes recommendations that Azerbaijan expedites structural policy reforms to move towards competitive markets and develops an effective energy efficiency strategy. Georgia's primary energy source is hydropower, of which only 12% is utilized at present. Recommendations for Georgia include continued development of a stable regulatory framework for the new electricity market model to work towards electricity market opening and a strengthened national regulatory authority. The report also covers 5 countries from Central Asia. Kazakhstan is among the world's top 10 fastest growing economies and has experienced strong growth over the past 2 decades, mainly through resource development and export-oriented policies. The report recommends that Kazakhstan continues to develop a national fuel and energy strategy to 2030, with an outlook to 2050, and ensures stable, predictable, fair, and transparent investment procedures. Kyrgyzstan is reliant on imports of oil and gas for more than half of its energy needs, particularly during the winter months when hydropower production is low. And among other recommendations, the report calls for Kyrgyzstan to develop a comprehensive rate structure for electricity and heat tariffs and raise public awareness on the real cost of electricity and a possible increase in tariffs. Tajikistan is almost exclusively reliant on hydro for its electricity generation. Despite reasonable energy potential, Tajikistan's energy sector is prone to supply shocks, particularly during winter months. The report has several recommendations for Tajikistan, including to provide affordable electricity and deal with winter shortages, and ensure the application of clean coal technologies. Turkmenistan is one of the largest gas resource holders in the Caspian region and holds significant volumes of recoverable oil. The government is continuing to invest in the oil and gas sector, including in a large project to modernize and expand the electricity and heat sector by 2020. The report includes recommendations for Turkmenistan to streamline energy sector governance, develop robust energy saving and energy efficiency policies, continue to phase out energy subsidies while protecting the most vulnerable end users. Uzbekistan is rich in natural gas resources and is the 3rd largest gas producer in the region. And despite energy self-sufficiency, Uzbekistan's aging electricity infrastructure and network underinvestments have led to electricity shortages, poor efficiency, high losses, and lack of reliability. So the report recommends Uzbekistan to take more aggressive actions for rehabilitation and replacement of the aging energy infrastructure and continue development of the country's vast solar potential. Now, apart from country-specific recommendation, the report lays out a series of recommendations across all regions. And on general energy policy, countries should prepare comprehensive sustainable energy strategies for the horizon beyond 2015 and revise or develop medium to long-term energy scenarios, making best use of energy data. And sustainable energy policy reforms or development must continue, including transparent implementation and enforcement of energy legislative frameworks. For the future, research and development activities should continue for smart investments in conventional and alternative energy developments. On energy security, there is a need for increasing production outputs, both in terms of conventional and unconventional sources, maximizing efficiency gains, and upgrading energy infrastructure. Investments into the energy supply chain should be encouraged through competitive and fair regulatory frameworks and market price incentives, and emergency response mechanisms should be developed, possibly including fuel storage build-ups for import-dependent countries. Now, collectively, the regions should review the market, particularly as new interconnections develop, and adapt market rules to enhance system interoperability and remove regulatory and trade barriers. and discussions should begin on setting up regional markets with neighboring countries. In part, this will mean strengthening the competencies and independence of national regulatory authorities. Now, in terms of sustainable development, countries should introduce balanced regulatory frameworks that promote renewable energy, including procedures for grid integration for variable renewables. And they should elaborate or boost implementation of energy efficiency plans, particularly for buildings and transport, coordinate energy efficiency measures regionally, while strengthening initiatives at local and city levels to encourage energy savings. Now, underlying many of these challenges is a need for investments. It's all about money. And of course, attracting investment has been a key focus of governments in the region since gaining their independence. One of the most successful changes in national legislation has been to liberalize fiscal structures to attract much-needed investment. And while initially based on project-by-project incentives, most of the countries have gradually moved to more widespread reforms. And the remaining impediments to attracting investments for upgrading and maintaining existing systems are tariff structures, where energy tariffs remain below cost recovery levels, and energy subsidies, which do not provide investors with the opportunity to recoup their investments. And those countries that have opted for regulatory reforms, in addition to privatizing their energy sectors, have generated greater benefits for their populations and industry at large. And there is a need for open, stable, predictable, fair, and transparent investment frameworks. And this will be necessary to mobilize investments into infrastructure and improve the performance and efficiency of the energy supply chain. Ladies and gentlemen, as you have seen, this report covers 3 vast regions with a wide variety of countries. Their challenges are sometimes shared, sometimes unique, much as their energy needs and resources vary. However, one goal that they all share is the creation of a sustainable, affordable, and secure energy system. And we sincerely hope that this report will pave the way for concrete, effective steps taken towards that goal. So let me conclude by saying that on behalf of the International Energy Agency, I would like to thank the European Union for the opportunity to produce this report, INOGATE partner countries for their participation in the peer review process, and INOGATE Technical Secretariat for organizational and logistical support throughout the review process. You know, dear friends, none of this would have been possible without such cooperation. Thank you for your attention.